Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar. This is the last webinar in a series of 4 taking place during March on the topic of offshore wind and nature. These webinars were organized by BirdLife Europe with the support of Renewable Grid Initiatives, the North Sea Foundation, and Natuur Milieu. My name is Anouk Puymartin, and I am the policy manager at BirdLife Europe in Central Asia. Last week, in our 3rd session, we got an overview of auctioning process and benefits of non-price standard criteria for offshore wind developments. We also had a discussion on nature inclusive design of offshore wind farms and the presentation of EU Horizon 2020 project, the United project on co-uses within offshore wind farms. Today is the last session of our webinar series, and we will explore in more depth this morning the question of decommissioning of offshore wind farms, followed by a discussion on how to monitor environmental impacts from offshore wind developments. After a break at 11:20, we will start looking at how this offshore wind expansion can create opportunity for a nature-positive renewable energy transition at sea, with perspective from both civil society and industry. But before we kick off, I would like to remind some few housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We also invite you to use your camera if possible, especially when you are asking a question or making an intervention. Feel free also to use our chat during the exchanges with other participants to ask questions. If you have questions that we don't have time to cover, we'll ask you to put them on the chat or by email, and follow up after the webinar. And if you want, of course, to take the floor, please use the raised hand button. Finally, we want to inform you that this webinar is recorded, and we will also, of course, share with you the recording of the webinar and all the presentation that were made during the 4th session. And now I will leave immediately the floor to Marjolein Kelder, Senior Project Leader Offshore Wind at Natuur Milieu, for the first presentation on the decommissioning. So thank you, Marjolein. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anouk. I will share my presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So yeah, as Anouk mentioned, my name is Marjolein Kelder. I'm working for a Dutch environmental NGO called Natuur Milieu, where I'm senior project lead on offshore wind and also on our program, the Rich North Sea. I will tell you a little bit today about why why Natuur Milieu and the the North Sea Foundation started looking into the topic of decommissioning in the offshore environment. To start off, I would like to start with a little bit of history of our North Sea. So if we look roughly 12,000 years ago, instead of a North Sea, or what we now know as the North Sea, was still land. The area was doggerland, and it consisted of sloping hills, marshland, heavy wooded valleys, and swampy lagoons. And then about 9,000 years ago, the ice started to melt, creating what we now know as our North Sea. And what we also know from old maps that we found is that about 200 years ago, in large parts of the North Sea, there were still oyster reefs occurring. But due to human activities, overfishing and disease, almost all these natural reefs have disappeared. And now some 89.5% of the North Sea is characterized by sandy and muddy seabed, in contrast to a greater proportion of hard substrate or rocky bottom that existed in the past, and that is believed to have supported greater biodiversity. So with this in mind, we look into why two NGOs started looking into the topic of decommissioning. Some years ago, first reports about biodiversity around artificial reef structures started to appear, and research suggested that man-made structures such as offshore platforms, pipelines, and renewable energy installations have a role in increasing biodiversity. Oil and gas platforms provide hard substrate, and in many cases they have been in the sea since the 1970s. A safety zone of 500 meters around these platforms excludes almost all shipping and bottom disturbing fishing. So this combination of hard substrate and no bottom disturbance has created some biodiversity hotspots around certain platforms. But we also know they will be decommissioned in the coming years. And this same combination of hard substrate and bottom rest is also relevant in offshore wind farms. So around the same time that these reports started to appear, a couple of years later, Natuur Milieu and the North Sea Foundation started the program called the Rich North Sea. The Rich North Sea seizes the opportunity that offshore wind farms offer to enhance nature in the North Sea. It aims to learn about different measures, such as, for example, testing artificial reefs and introduce source populations of what we can see here, for example, European flat oyster. It aims to spread the knowledge and anchor nature enhancement in policy and legislation as the standard in every new offshore wind farm. And as we know, we are in the middle of a nature and climate crisis, and marine renewable energy, such as offshore wind farms, are expanding rapidly to deliver the necessary carbon emission reductions and to reach climate goals. So the ambitions for these expansions are huge, with the North Sea planned to host a significant proportion of this offshore wind capacity in Europe, with around 450 gigawatts by 2050. And in our Dutch part of the North Sea, there's an ambition of 70 gigawatts by 2050. So these permits for offshore wind farms last between 25 to 40 years. And the question came within our foundations, what if we, with our program, manage to enhance nature in such a way that it helps create a resilient North Sea? Or what if we learn about this? What happens at the end of a permit? And it was enough reason for us to start looking into the subject of decommissioning, and also realizing we need to look into this now and make decisions now before of this big ambition is all built in the North Sea, allowing for design to potentially account for eco-friendly decommissioning principles, or at least look at it before everything is built. So the program started looking into the topic of decommissioning along 3 different pillars. We looked into the legal framework, where the questions we asked the University of Utrecht were, first, is there an obligation to remove the objects placed for nature restoration purposes? And does international law or EU law provide grounds or duties to leave the objects partially or wholly in place? Then we also are looking into a part of the business case together with Echt. The report will be ready in May 2023, and it looks at the effect of leaving parts of the foundation behind in terms of costs. And COBINE is an ecological monitoring program that valorizes the natural values of nature inclusive design, where results are expected next year. I will now deep dive a little bit into the legal framework and what we got out of the reports from the University of Utrecht. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is the overarching international legal framework within which, in principle, all marine activities take place. And it states that all man-made structures need to be removed. But then looking into the IMO guidelines, they leave room for coastal states to decide whether an offshore installation or parts thereof can remain on the seabed. It also states it should always be a case-by-case evaluation. And then looking at OSPAR, they say if the competent national authority decides that a component of the wind farm should remain at site, it should be ensured that they have no adverse impact on the environment, that safety of navigation and other uses of the sea. And the status of remaining parts should be monitored, and if necessary, appropriate measures should be taken. It is good to mention that rules for offshore wind energy, at least in the Netherlands, and I believe this is the case in other countries as well. The rules are not the same for offshore wind as for other human activities or infrastructure. So in the Netherlands, offshore wind is handled under the Offshore Wind Energy Law, and mining is handled under the mining law. So now looking further into the offshore wind part that we have investigated further is when it comes to decommissioning, a distinction has been made between objects placed in between wind turbines, so standalone artificial reefs, and objects that are placed on or that are part of the monopile or scour protection of the wind turbine, and thereby, legally speaking, are part of the wind turbine as a single installation. I will share some examples of nature-inclusive designs and nature enhancement measures for you to see the difference. Here is a clear example of a part that is part of the design measure. Vattenfall added water replenishment holes in the foundation, allowing marine life to enter and leave again. And I don't know if this starts. But we here measure biotic and abiotic factors to learn about the effectiveness of the measure. A less obvious part of the design, but still part of the design, is a measure that we do with Eneco in the Luchterduinen wind farm. These are broodstock outplacement structures. And because they are placed on the scour protection of the wind turbine, it is therefore part of this design and part of the permit of the wind turbine. This is what it now looks, what the scour looks like underwater, to again get a little bit of an idea why we are looking into the topic and ask ourselves the question, what happens if we decommission at the end? Again, part of the design, part of the permit are these outplacement structures at Blauwind. Because they are placed on the scour protection, they are part of the design and part of the permit. These are structures and examples of artificial reefs that are not part of the design, and therefore they require their own permit. On the left hand, you see reef cubes from Arc Marine that we are testing in an offshore test site. And on the right hand side are pipe reefs for cod at the Borselen wind farm of Ørsted. Because they are placed in between the turbines, they are not part of the design. And in the Netherlands, this is seen as co-use or multi-use in a wind farm. So if we would build on the assumption that an object is indeed left in place upon expiry of the permit, the second main question that was addressed in the legal report concerned the possibility and/or duties of the coastal state under international and European law to take additional measures to protect the restored or created nature on and around the object. It is concluded that international law does not impose an obligation of results to protect the created nature, but rather an obligations of due diligence, a duty of care, to take the environmental values into account when deciding on whether and under which conditions other activities may be permitted in the same area. So to summarize, for both categories of objects, the artificial reefs or the monopile, scour, or parts of the design, the conclusion is that international law and European law do not impose an absolute obligation to fully remove the objects. Coastal states, in principle, enjoy a wide measure of discretion under international and EU law to determine whether or not to have the object removed or to leave it partially in place. It always requires a case-by-case assessment. A legally important consideration in this connection is whether the removal of the object could pose a risk or serious harm to the marine environment. So it depends on the type of object and the degree to which it contributes to restoring or maintaining an important habitat in a particular location, whether and which additional protective measures may be called for. It's not very likely, but it is possible. So on the 11th of May, we are hosting another webinar by the Rich North Sea, where the University of Utrecht will elaborate further on the legal framework. This January, we already hosted a first webinar on decommissioning, and future topics to discuss that came out of this webinar were the following. So the value of nature, to elaborate further on the legal framework, liability and responsibility of leaving structures behind. The redesign of a wind farm, what if we leave behind, what needs to be taken into account. The potential repowering, so no decommissioning, but just use the wind farm again for more wind. And the effect that leaving offshore wind has on other industries. I'm keen to hear later in the Q&A if we are missing any subjects or that there are other future topics to discuss. So Natuur Milieu and the Rich North Sea, or the North Sea Foundation, sorry, came up with a first draft of conditions under which to leave parts of infrastructure behind. And we are now working together in the Netherlands with industry to further discuss this. Some of the conditions we came up with are the following. So this decision needs to be based on a proven benefit for local biodiversity. Second one is the decision has to be based on independent scientific research and advice. When removing, it is never an indefinite decision. It always has to be a postponement. And this is also why industry says there needs to be some legal framework if it is decided to leave parts behind. Decisions about leaving infrastructure behind cannot set a legal precedent for other infrastructures. It always needs to be a case-by-case approach. No ecological or new ecological risks have to be introduced with the abandonment, and cost-benefit assessments of this, again, should be done by an independent party. And finally, the safety zone around turbine, or if you're looking at offshore gas platforms, need to be maintained on the one hand to guarantee safety for shipping and fishermen, but on the other hand also to protect the natural values that have arisen in that area. A lot of questions still remain, and it is a relevant topic. Luckily, other initiatives and programs are also looking into the topic right now. So the Living North Sea initiative was a North Sea-wide scientific-based program that was supported by oil and gas industry to explore new opportunities for restoring healthy North Sea. And it was inspired by Rigs to Reef and other ecosystem restoration programs elsewhere in the world. Then the Insight program, a really interesting program, was launched in 2014 with the aim of providing stakeholders with independent scientific evidence-based that is needed to better understand the influence of man-made structures on the ecosystem of the North Sea. And within Ocean this year, we are also having a task force on sustainability criteria, where we are looking into decommissioning and option criteria. Hopefully this will all lead to making an informed decision that benefits nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think you can stop sharing and we can open the floor to questions and discussions. So if there is any question, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. I see already 2 hands. So Andrea Cervantes, you can take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. Andrea Cervantes from CCB. I'm biodiversity officer. I had a question on the toxic or the release of toxic chemicals. What is the conditions for this? Like how would it be that there's a case where no toxic chemicals would be released? Like, I know there's these like coatings for preventing corrosion, but how long does that last? Like, where would be the case where we could prevent this release of chemicals? Yeah.
You're muted, Marjolein.
So yeah, just let me say that I'm not the expert on this. We are just looking into the legal framework and drafting up first conditions. But what I can imagine, just looking at offshore wind, is that where the discussion is going most of the time, if there's talk about leaving parts behind, discussion is mostly about leaving scour protection behind and removing of the foundation. So then I imagine yeah, scour is just rocks, so there's no case of but this is just my idea if I think about it and where the discussion goes. What I do know, we looked into, if you look at the oil and gas platforms, there are it's again if leaving something behind, it's all leaving something behind underwater, not above water, so you would cut off parts of the jacket. And then there are cases of drill cutting piles where the discussion is whether or not disturbing the piles or leaving them in place, what would do more harm. So again, this should be researched and advice has to be made about it by experts.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Hi, Marjolein. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it's very topical because we are all struggling with dealing with decommissioning. I have a two-part question. The first one is about the desirability of leaving hard substrate infrastructure in an environment that is of natural soft substrate. So I can understand if you have a natural hard substrate environment that you leave artificial reefs because you're enhancing the same fauna. However, a lot of wind farms are installed in areas of mobile sandbanks. So installing or leaving scar protection there is on the one hand temporary because they will get covered in time. And on the other hand, you're creating a habitat for species that were not naturally occurring there. Yeah, if you look at the last 1,000, not 12,000 years. And then the second question is that a lot of these beneficial effects depend on the absence of fishing pressure. So we are excluding fisheries in wind farms, or at least bottom trawling fisheries in wind farms. And we are doing that for, as you mentioned, 25 to 40 years. This has also been a sort of an agreement with fishermen that for this period, they will not be able to use the area. If you are now going to have to announce that this area is going to be off limits for fisheries indefinitely, I think we will have issues with our stakeholders. So are you doing some studies on that, or are you preparing a consultation there?
Yeah, thank you. I think both questions are things we are struggling with as well. To first go into the first topic, it's of course something we discuss with the program of the Rich North Sea as well. What is the desired state of the North Sea, where you want to go? Yeah, in sandy environments, do you want to add hard substrate? What is the, how far back do you want to go? What is the ideal site? So we really advocate for that. There needs to be a vision for the North Sea and looking into protected areas, offshore wind, nature enhancement, a bigger plan on what we are working towards, and that hopefully would help with making all these decisions in, does it help with achieving this overall goal that we decided upon together, that we want to achieve. I can imagine. So what we at least are saying is that, yeah, the natural values should always be the reason that you even consider decommissioning just partly. So I can imagine a situation where maybe a great worm reefs, so no oyster reefs, but yeah, so in some parts oyster reefs, but in other parts sand mason worms or something has been created that could be destroyed maybe when removing everything. I can imagine that would be a situation where you do an analysis on what is beneficial. And again, a decision should be independent scientific research-based decision and a case-by-case approach. And then your other question about the use of the area, I can definitely imagine. So one of the reasons we would like to look into maybe leaving parts behind is that we now know if we just remove everything, fisheries will get access to it again, and that's it. So that's why we're also saying, yeah, maintain a safety zone around it. But it's a really busy sea and there's not enough, or yeah, it's already a big discussion. So we are definitely taking that into account when we're working towards more of a position paper, and then that will definitely be addressed and taken into account. We have the North Sea Agreement in the Netherlands, where we are part of. So if we come up with a position paper like this, we will always announce it to the North Sea Agreement stakeholders first, where fisheries is part of it. And I can imagine there will be discussion. Yeah. I don't know if it answers the question, but yes, we are having the same.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have, but it's definitely one worth having indeed. Thank you.
Is there any other questions or just comments or reflection? Daniel, please.
Thank you. So I have a question about repowering and like what are the constraints around that? Because I mean, when I think about decommissioning, I think kind of like the spatial and the usage after decommissioning, and I suppose in an ideal world, the areas that have been selected for offshore wind farms are those where impacts on nature are going to be minimized. So if we start partially decommissioning, leaving this space as a kind of potentially protected area from fisheries, then we need to build the next wind farm in another area. So yeah, I was wondering, you know, if these sites were indeed selected to be the best ones in terms of nature, then what are the constraints in just repowering?
Yeah, I do see the discussion with industry and all stakeholders going that way, that assuming that after the permit ends, we still are in need of offshore wind, we haven't found some great, wonderful thing that solves all the problems, then repowering is I think one of the most likely options. But also then we need to start thinking about design now, because the way turbines are designed now, they are the future turbines in 25 years is going to be too big for the foundation that is placed. So then there would be a decommissioning and a new turbine besides it. So then we would really need to start thinking about a modular design in which has the least disturbance for the surrounding area, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? If not, I think we can go to the second presentation of the morning. So I will leave the floor to Bob from the Royal Belgium Institute of Natural Science to talk about monitoring of environmental impacts, and in particular a case study on the Windmorn Belgium program in Belgium. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Anouk. Let's see if this works. Voilà.
That works really well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us to speak on behalf of the WindMon program. My name is Bob Rumes. I work at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, where together with my colleagues Stephen, Laurence and Robin, we coordinate the WindMon program, which is the centralized monitoring of the environmental effects of offshore wind farms in Belgium. As our previous speaker did, I will go back in time, but only a little bit. Here you can see a picture of the first full-scale wind farm being built in 2009. Prior to that, we only had 6 demonstration turbines at Sea Power. And since then, Belgium's been quite active in installing offshore wind energy. And right now we have around 400 turbines with 2.2 gigawatts of installed capacity, which up until 2 years ago, I think made us 4th in Europe. Denmark has overtaken us since, and I'm sure France will at some point, because we have quite a small marine area. These 400 turbines are taking up around 7% of our total area. And the future plans will make sure that we have at least 15, close to 20% of our marine area dedicated to offshore wind. So we want to do it in a way that's environmentally responsible. I've added this little detail to show that for the available surface, we did install most that we could. I should quickly discuss the licensing. So licensing of offshore wind farms in Belgium is a relatively short procedure. It has 3 stages, and there are roles for the developer, which are indicated in red, roles for the advising authority, the independent advising authority, which is our BINS, and roles for the ministry, which is will need to take the decision based on the advice given. So first there is a consultation by the developer who has to ask us what the environmental impact study should look like. So the scoping of the environmental impact study. He then drafts the environmental impact study and submits it. It is then checked for completeness, and then the environmental review starts. And this is where this is the only part where we have the public participation. And this is a fairly top-down process and takes only 60 days. So it is not a broad stakeholder consultation, I should say. And at the end of this period, which this evaluation takes about 120 days or 4 months, then we deliver the advice to the minister, who then has 2 months to get to the final permit. Now, why am I going into this? Because I want to say that it's a relatively fast procedure. There are multiple opportunities for information exchange between the authority and the developer and the ministry, but not that many for the public. And it is a very top-down process. So one thing that does get done during this whole procedure is it defines the scope of the environmental monitoring needed, and the environmental monitoring becomes part of the license. So the WindMon scheme is actually dependent on the contributions from the different developers. So each developer pays a contribution to the monitoring, which then gets lumped into the overall WindMon fund, which is managed by the legal department, I would say, of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, which is the management unit of the North Sea mathematical models. These then have formed a scientific consortium consisting of the universities, research institutes, and the research arm of the museum. Now, how do we define what needs to be studied in the monitoring program? This is an iterative process, and it's been described by Gill et al. In his oceanography paper, where you have feedback between the public, but also scientists, policymakers, and industry, and then the scientists conducting the work. So the first step is to scope for societally major concerns. Partly this happens during the licensing, during the public consultation. But this also happens on a 5-year 5-year cycle where we have a general consultation. Based on these society major concerns, overarching questions are identified by the scientists. These need to be verified again by the people who raised the concerns, after which a long list of operational questions is made, and from which specific operational questions are selected, which then finally lead to the monitoring plan and the research plan. Now, at the risk of becoming kicking in a few open doors, I will highlight the basic principles of the WinMon.be approach to monitoring environmental impacts. We not only want to observe them, but we want to understand them. We need to have the appropriate long-term perspective. There is a need for an adaptive approach to monitoring and management. We coordinate our efforts at a regional scale, and there is a public right to environmental information. I will go into a little bit of detail here. So what we see most often is a monitoring that is directed at observing impacts. So quantifying and observing impacts, but not necessarily understanding them. They are often project or area specific, and they are a mandatory part of the licensing procedure in just about every country. However, to that, we have added targeted monitoring, which focuses on cause-effect relationships and understanding rather than observing impacts. The idea is to get more spatially generic information and to have a basis for future licensing and mitigation of effects. An example of moving from observing to understanding impacts is, for example, the artificial reef effect. So immediately after installing our wind farms, we had angling studies going on, and we found very high densities of cod and pouting at the wind turbine foundations, much higher than at the natural sandy bottom, and even higher than at the local wrecks. So we tagged a number of fish that were observed there to find out whether they were using the area just as a shelter or as a meeting point, or whether they were feeding there, and how they were using the area. And we observed that they mostly stayed at the edge between the scour protection and the sandy bottom, which gave us insight into their location. But then we did stomach content analysis and stable isotope analysis, and we found that there are 3 different groups of fish. So one example is the mackerel. Mackerel were found in high densities around the turbines, but if you looked at their stomach contents, they fed on planktonic species. So they were just aggregating there. On the other hand, second group, horse mackerel, did feed on the fouling fauna on the turbines. So their stomach content is filled with these tiny crabs and amphipods. However, if you do the stable isotope analysis, you see that it's only for a short time. So they are opportunistically feeding near the turbines. On the other hand, the third group, which included cod, plaice, and pouting, was not only having these epifouling organisms in their stomach, but also, based on stable isotope analysis, has been feeding on them for months. which matched our tagging data of animals residing near the turbines for periods of multiple months, especially during summer. If you look at fish in between the turbines, so the soft sediment-associated fish species, we found only after quite a few years slightly increased densities of solonet, common dragonet, and lesser weaver, which is probably due to this combination of fishery exclusion and increased or changed food availability. We did a focus study on place, where we actually started to sample place both on the scar protection between the turbines, in a nearby control site and in a further away control site. And we found both a larger fish size inside the wind farm and a sex ratio that is skewed towards more females. Why is this important? Because females, it's a dimorphic fish, and females are fish species, and females tend to be larger than the males, so they are more likely to get caught by fisheries. So they were doing quite well, and they were also having a diet shift where both the gut contents and the fatty acids indicated they were feeding on hard substrate praise. So there's some evidence for offshore wind farms and scar protection as a production of certain fish species. Why do we need a long-term perspective? There's multiple reasons, and one is to be able to confidently detect impacts. So we have bird surveys, monthly bird surveys, where they count the birds in the wind farms, but also in a reference area. And here I will illustrate it for razorbill and northern gannet, but this also applies to the other species that we observed. And the fact is that despite these monthly surveys, the likelihood of being able to detect a 75% decrease with a 90% confidence is quite low, given the number of birds and the variability in birds detected during the surveys. So it took us already 3 to 4 years to be able to detect, or it would take us 3 to 4 years to be able to detect a 75% decrease. And for a 55% decrease, we need to survey more than 10 years, which we have done. And thankfully, there is no 50% decrease, but at least our confidence with which we can state it is quite high. And the most important conclusion here is that for most wind farms, surveys are done in the first 5 years with similar frequencies. So often there is no effect. But not being able to detect an effect doesn't mean that there is no real effect. You have two options to increase power. One is to increase the monitoring efforts, so more surveys per time, but this was not logistically possible for us, so we decided to monitor for a longer period. It's also true that you need this long-term perspective to detect changes at the relevant timescales. This I will illustrate with the fouling fauna on the structures. So we had our first 2 wind farms. First were gravity-based foundations, which were installed in fairly turbid coastal waters on concrete foundation in the summer of 2008. And the other one was at Blijbank, where we had steel monopile foundations installed in summer in clearer offshore waters. The first 7 years that we looked at the fouling fauna, we found distinct differences between the 2 sites, which could lead you to conclude that, okay, because of the substrate, timing of installation, nature of the waters, you get different fouling fauna. But after year 8, these fouling faunas converged into a series of similar stable climaxes defined by not only mussels, which serve as a foundation species and provide habitat to many other species, but also the keystone predators, which are the common sea star, which forage on these mussels, and which are also balanced out by Mitridium, or large anemones, which smother part of the flowering fauna and which inhibit the settlement of other species, which we then named space invaders, although the reviewers did not like that one. Now, the main role of this slide is to show you that you need to look at it for a long time to be able to see what is really going on. And also to mention that this fouling fauna's main role is to filter the water column and produce fecal pellets, which brings us to the next slide, where we found that all this filtration results in an increase of total organic carbon flux to the sediment, and led to an enriched macrobenthic community. This was shown in 2008 at the edge of the scour protection, and by 2012 it had moved up to 25, even 50 meters from the scour protection. However, as recently as 2022, we saw that it reached distances up to 150 meters. And a modeling study by Yevgeny Ivanov shows that this will, in time, so in the 20 years that the wind farm is operational, lead to an increase of total organic carbon deposition of up to 50% in an area of 5 kilometers around the turbine foundations. So the whole wind farm area is being changed. The whole macrobenthic community is changing. So it's the bottom of the food web. It is quite a fundamental change for that area. As a third principle, we have an adaptive approach to monitoring and management. I have been involved in licensing in a previous period. When we plan what is going to happen, we start the monitoring and we found out that very much things can change. So you need to be able to have this flexibility to adjust both your management of your wind farm, but also your monitoring program. I think you mentioned 30 years lifetime, so permit conditions and monitoring actually need to be adapted because of new scientific insights. One fun example to me is bat migration. So initially planning the wind farms, there was no bats chapter because we had little or no data of bats at sea. As soon as they were being built, we got quite a few scattered observations of bats, and we were able to start a program of installing bat detectors and systematically register their migration events, not only at the height of the nacelle, so where the wind turbine blades are, but also at the height of the transition piece, so at 16 meters versus 86 meters. The good news is that the registered activity at nacelle height was only 10% of what was registered under the wings. And a network of 11 detectors was installed. What you see on the graph is the bat activity during 3.5 months, and the shaded area is the time between dusk and dawn. And from this systematic registration, we are now able to get into the field of predicting bat movement and actually looking at mitigation, because meteorological conditions are proving quite accurate predictors of the presence of Natusius pipistrelle at sea. So bats have a clear preference for low wind speed, which is as expected, but they also tend to migrate when they have tailwind conditions under certain conditions of temperature and moisture. So a higher cut-in wind speed could actually lower the risk for bats, and this combined with the other meteorological data and the data on seasonality would mean that we could reduce 87% of collisions by having a dedicated mitigation strategy. The issue is that we have to agree on this with our Dutch neighbors because the wind farms are adjacent. Another field where we had to make changes to the license, so the management of the environmental license, is for harbor porpoise, where we observed quite strong avoidance during the construction period, so up to 20 kilometers for multiple days during pile driving. And this is related to the excessive noise levels that are generated during pile driving. And it's a fairly well-known phenomenon. And so the licensing conditions for construction of wind farms were adapted so that people could only under specific circumstances start pile driving, and they would not be able to exceed a noise threshold. Currently, they're achieving this noise threshold by using double big bubble curtains and using techniques to make sure that there are no porpoises at the start of pile driving. Now, on this slide, you see the Belgian wind farms in the center. And you see that they are located next to the French, respectively, next to the French and Dutch border. And which is what the Dutch and French are also doing at Borselen and Dunkirk. So almost all of our environmental impacts are likely to have transboundary components. And in the case of large migrating species, such as seabirds and marine mammals, assessing the cumulative impacts of offshore wind development will require a North Sea approach, which is why the WindMon program actively cooperates with the programs of the neighboring countries and facilitates and contributes to EU research projects. In addition, it also feeds into regional and international groups studying the environmental effects at larger scales. Finally, there's the public right to environmental information. And that's, I would say, is a bit of a contentious one. So during the time that the wind farm monitoring was drafted, Belgium decided to interpret the Aarhus Convention to such a degree that the public has a right to all environmental information collected during the monitoring of the wind farms. This means not only that the raw data is available through a data platform, in this case, the Belgian Marine Data Center, but also that there needs to be a yearly reporting, which should be freely available. And all scientific publications resulting from the monitoring should follow an open access publishing strategy. It seems obvious to me, but it is not widely applied within Europe. And I would like to thank you for your attention and try to stop sharing. There you go.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. The floor is now open for questions or comment or discussion in general. If anyone wants to take the floor or leave a question in the chat, that's the moment. Matilda?
See if hi, Matilda Karlsson from WWF Sweden. I was just thinking about the harbor porpoise, since we know they avoid areas when pile driving is underway. Do we know if they return to the wind farm after the construction phase is done? And if so, how long does it take for them to actually come back?
Yeah, so there's during pile driving, we see that they return to the area. It just depends on the frequency of pile driving, because our initial wind farms, they would do one pile driving every 2 to 3 days, which gave them enough time to return and to be scared away afterwards. However, recently, the construction has become much more efficiently, so they can do one pile driving every 12 hours, which matches the time that they avoid the area. So there's a more complete habitat loss, but for a much shorter period. That's during pile driving. Then there's the operational phase, which is even more difficult to answer for me. So on the one hand, there is data suggesting that porpoises in certain wind farms avoid the area even after construction. And it's data from either Denmark or Sweden. Probably Denmark, they have more wind farms. But if you look at the studies that we have done with aerial surveys, we do not see such an avoidance. Again, as I told about the seabirds, it's not because we don't see it that it's not there, but so far we don't see it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Renate, please.
Hey, Bob, thanks for your presentation. I have a question about the monitoring, targeted monitoring and research. Can you explain me a little bit more the difference between those three? Because I have a little bit of difficulty in making this distinction.
Yep. So so it's between the basic monitoring and the targeted monitoring, right? Or is it between target monitoring and research?
Yeah, all three.
All three. Okay, fine. And then I will simplify things for you. The targeted monitoring is a form of research. So there's no real distinction there. The difference between the basic monitoring is that's the one that's really obligatory following the law. So if you look at the EU directive on EIA, you want to quantify the effects that you have associated with an activity. So you need to say, okay, we predicted that this impact is going to happen. Is it happening, yes or no? And what's the extent of the impact? So you just measure, to be on to say it. And the targeted monitoring is where you want to understand what is the cause-effect mechanism that's going on. And what we see is that, for example, for the licensing of wind farms in the UK, very often there's an obligation to do an basic monitoring. So you quantify what's happening, but you do not try to put it in a broader context, or really, there is not necessarily a need to go in there.
That's clear, yeah. And the bad mitigation, is that already being done in Belgium? Because I know we have it in the Netherlands, but you said you have to agree with us on the same.
Yeah, we have proposed it. And my colleague Robin is in talks with the Dutch, because I don't think you apply it yet. It's done. It's very common on onshore, but not offshore.
Well, I was pretty sure that the best mitigation measure was already in place. Okay.
Yeah.
And the birds?
Birds, you mean during migration?
Yes.
There is currently no mitigation for birds applied. I know that you're working on it.
Yeah, we're starting this year. Yeah, actually now.
Yeah.
Good to know.
It's a very clear example of what we can do when we work together, because it's a very small North Sea corridor, and they need to pass Belgian, Dutch, and UK wind farms. So if we don't align our mitigation measures, they will not function.
Yes, indeed, very good point. Thank you. I don't know if there are any other question right now, because we have a bit of time actually before the break. So that's time for, yeah, any question or just comments, even on the first part of the morning session, if you have any question following Marjolein presentation this morning before we break. Ah, I see Renata again, please.
To Bob, if you would think about the North Sea Basin and you would like to have it more standardized, all this monitoring or targeted monitoring, what step would you like to take? How do you connect to all these countries and kind of do the same thing or understand mechanisms better?
I'd have the UK rejoin the EU first, so we could join again into the different platforms where we work together. Right now, I think we have measuring standards for underwater noise. I think we have standards for seabird surveys at sea. So these methodological standards are a very good step, because then at least we're measuring the same thing. We have done some efforts within CEAF, so it's the Common Environmental Assessment Framework, to develop a strategy to at least agree on how to measure cumulative effects. I think aligning our monitoring programs more would be definitely a step forward. So, for example, doing our surveys at a similar time. I would say we are working towards it already. One thing that could be done is to get a common fund. So funding in WOZEP is quite good. And our situation is also quite comfortable, but in too many other places, it's very much project dependent. So to move away from project dependent monitoring and go to a national or European monitoring program, I would say is a good step.
Thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, it's a question for Bob and kind of a follow-up to what you just said. I mean, do you have any idea why other countries haven't gone down the same route that Belgium's gone down with this kind of centralized system? Because, I mean, at least from my perspective, it seems to make a lot of sense.
So I would say we had the advantage of just being small enough. So it was quite logical to join these efforts. The Dutch WOZEP program is also moving in the same direction. So they now have open data policy and they do coordinate it at a national scale. And even Germany, which was a bit hesitant, is now moving towards open data. So I think I think we're evolving in the right direction. Why didn't we do it? Why wasn't it started that way initially? I would say because we're used to thinking on a project-to-project basis, and this is a problem that you cannot address on a project-to-project basis. So it just needed a mental shift.
Please, Marjolein.
Yeah, just really curious, simple question. Could you have done the same if you wouldn't have been allowed to dive within the wind farms, if you would have to use an ROV or something? Does that make a difference?
I would say only a minority of our sampling is done by diving. So I myself had the fortune to dive in the wind farm, and you indeed, it's an impressive artificial reef. But what we do is we do, when we dive, we do scrape sampling and recovery of lost devices. All the rest is done by boat or by ROV. So it's not a crucial part to our research.
Thank you. Just maybe question to connect a bit the two presentation of this morning. How in your perspectives, monitoring of environmental impact can also be supportive to the research that the Region North Sea are currently doing on the decommissioning. If you have some perspective on this.
I think we are definitely very interested in what Marjolein is doing. And it's our information, I think, can feed into their analyses. So we have a lot of information on how fish now are using these artificial reefs, what kind of organisms grow on these artificial reefs, and some data also on the permanence, depending, of course, on where you locate these scar protections. You can get, I mentioned one wind farm called Sea Power. It's built on mobile sandbanks. So there you get movements of sands up to 1 meter per year. So the scar protection is less permanent there than, for example, at other areas. And that's something that you can take into account when you say, okay, we're going to leave some structures behind, or it means you have to change your design if you want to have a permanent artificial reef. I would say, so this is a bit moving away from my field of comfort, but I would say when you think about leaving infrastructure at sea, if you're considering a scar protection that's made of often natural stone, there's very little detrimental effect. And it's not that much of a cost-saving measure. When you think about the oil and gas industry, sometimes it's been considered as a cost-saving measure. Just leave it at sea and you can say it's good for fish and an artificial reef. But to some degrees, it's an economic decision. This is not the case when you leave scar protection at sea, because the cost of removing scar protection is minimal compared to the cost of removing all the other structures. So it's a more, you can have a cleaner discussion about it.
And even in the oil and gas industry, what we have found is that, so because they have this, they need to remove it at end of life. Even if you decide to leave parts behind, what we say, it's a postponement. It's never an indefinite decision. And for a business that is, that has to remove it at the end, it's not interesting to leave the costs of potential removal on their business case for eternity. So there would have to be some governmental structure that takes over this responsibility to remove it in the end, because otherwise you could get a really weird situation where potentially some NGO says the nature created here is unique, we need to leave it in place, but the industry saying we want to remove it because we cannot have this on our balance indefinite. So decommissioning is a really difficult topic that we started looking from it from the, of course, the nature perspective that should be leading in our point of view. But once you start talking about decommissioning, there's so many different aspects as economic decisions, safety, use of land. It's a huge topic.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question, any last question on this session before we break? Otherwise, we can start the break a bit earlier and reconvene at 11:40 as planned in the program. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I think it's also building on the next discussion on how we need to leave this project by project approach and have a more broad, holistic approach of everything. And we will explore that with Samuel and Amy later on the nature positive energy transition. So see you all at 11:40. Thank you very much.
Merci, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you for being still so many for the last session of our webinar and of our series of webinar. So now we will have the last session on the nature positive and offshore wind expansion. And immediately I will leave the floor to Samuel Wrobel, Policy Officer on offshore wind at the RSPB, the UK BirdLife partner. Samuel, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Anouk. I hope you can see that screen there as well now. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's been really good webinar series, and this morning has been some really interesting topics being covered, and loads of points actually that I've kind of flagged a lot of components that I'm going to be talking about here in terms of nature positive renewable energy transition at sea. So we're talking about the wider measures and this kind of wider suite of additionality that is required. We are the RSPB, we are the bird people, so it's always good to put in context of birds. And so I'll start with the bad, but only to just briefly kind of contextualize why we need these wider suite of measures and why we use seabirds so much and why they are our focus point. They are good indicators of health of the marine ecosystem. They are near the top of the food chain, so what they are telling us tells us what's going on throughout the rest of that ecosystem. What they're telling us isn't exactly good news. Seabirds are the fastest declining group of birds on the globe, and particularly here in the UK, only one of our breeding seabirds are not listed on a red or amber list. So there is a mounting amount of pressures on our seabirds. That ranges from invasive non-native species at their breeding areas, marine development, fisheries bycatch, habitat changes through their warming climate. In the last 18 months, we've seen highly pathogenic avian influenza or bird flu sweeping across Northern Europe. This has been wiping out some of our seabird colonies. We have seen total destruction of some of them, and particularly in the chicks. It's been pushing some species towards extinction, which isn't a word we like to use lightly. So it has been a tough 18 months to watch that on top of a legacy of pressures already in our system. And so this is a new and additional pressure alongside things like offshore wind that are accelerating and expanding. So despite all of our current marine legislation, our strategies and political commitments that are being made, we should be in no doubt that so far we have failed to turn the tide on accumulating pressures and biodiversity decline in our seas. Our seabirds are still declining. Our ambitions to achieve good environmental status are still strong, but so far remain woefully behind. Seabirds, in fact, are one of the few descriptors here that are not only failing good environmental status, but actually moving away from that target. So they are still declining despite these legislations and these conversations. So we have, mired ineffective planning systems, poor enforcement, underinvestment, decision making, which kind of repeatedly trades off these short-term profits against environmental benefit at sea, which is all very depressing, and that's all the bad news. However, we do have an opportunity. Offshore wind is coming. It is coming into all of our seas. There is a fantastic opportunity there to use that ambition and how we can kind of forge this new path forward, using that momentum and developing a new system and a new planning system throughout our seas. So this is where we come into nature positive. So it goes without saying that we recognize that kind of upscaling of offshore wind is absolutely vital. I mentioned there one of the pressures for seabirds, climate change is having unprecedented effects on our seabirds, on our wildlife. We need to decarbonize our energy system. We need to move away from fossil fuels. Offshore wind is a clear way of doing that. But what we can't do in that process is kind of risk adding more pressure to an already quite depleted system. So it's a delicate balance. We have to combat the climate crisis and climate emergency, but we cannot forget that this is a dual emergency. This is a dual nature and climate emergency. We can't do one without the other. So offshore wind must be done hand in hand with halting biodiversity loss, embedding resilience and restoring the healthy seas. So this is what we mean when we use the term nature positive. Nature positive is the buzzword at the moment. That's why we're talking about it today. It's being used throughout industry and NGOs. But what we need to be clear on is that it involves these industry and government-led actions that go beyond halting loss. So if you think of it like a chart and a graph, seabirds or wildlife and nature and biodiversity is declining. We halt decline, but then we build resilience, we enhance and we restore and we build it back up again. And that is what the component and the whole approach of nature positive is all about. So all industry sectors and governments have a role to play here. NGOs have a role to play here. It's a mosaic of approaches at different levels, all working together, collaborating, applying different measures, monitoring, adaptive management, learning as we go. It's a whole approach. It's not just kind of a one trick all. So we need to power healthy seas. And this is where I kind of mentioned about before with this ambition of offshore wind. So we need to establish a strategic approach to delivering nature protection mechanisms. They can't be done on a local basis. They can't be done on an individual project by project. It's about applying these wider suite of measures that go into this restoration and enhancement. So powering healthy seas, we spoke about this in our report last year of powering healthy seas, accelerating nature positive offshore wind. This was very much a starting point for a lot of these conversations. It was bringing a lot of this into the forefront. We are continuing to develop that thinking. We are continuing to develop how nature positive can be applied across our systems. So this is the same in the UK, in that most of our seas here in the UK, but most of our seas across Europe and particularly across the North Sea basin will experience offshore wind in one way or the other, or renewable offshore energy in one way or the other in the next decade. So interacting not only with our wildlife, but other industries too, such as fisheries as a prime example. So that ambition, that reach, that scale provides this opportunity for a catalyst for change. So we're not saying that offshore wind is going to be the sole answer to a lot of this, but that government ambition for that much offshore wind is a real opportunity to change the way that we manage our seas. We need joint solutions. This is a dual nature and climate emergency. So it's all within our interest here to protect this environment, whether we're here conserving and protecting it, whether we're here using that natural environment for resources, for offshore wind development, for fisheries. We're all using that environment. So it's very much within our interest to protect it and ensure that it continues to help. Reaching net zero is not going to be possible unless we have a healthy marine environment. This is our ally in our fight against climate change. So we have this strategic nature protection. So this is where we're halting loss. We have the mitigation hierarchy that must be followed. At first, avoid impacts. Where we can't avoid, we need to mitigate those impacts. And any residual impacts that cannot be avoided or mitigated must be compensated. That order must be followed, and that is essential. We cannot skip straight to compensating for any damage that might be caused. So that is your baseline. But there is a series of other steps that can happen throughout the halting loss. I mean, down to things like Bob was talking about in terms of evidence base and doing this monitoring. A robust and strategic evidence base that provides the certainty for developers can inform siting of new offshore wind farms. We can look at least sensitive areas and sensitivity mapping. We can't do that successfully without a strategic evidence base. That comes down to sharing of data, being aware of the data, and working collaboratively to achieve that common goal. Where marine spatial planning is incomplete or outdated, we need to see full reforms of country-level marine plans for offshore renewables. We're seeing that here in the UK across all 4 countries are at different stages of marine planning. There are benefits in some and not in the others, and that reform is coming forward. This will help better coordinate the expansion across our seas and assess ecological impacts from the outset. And we're seeing that across the North Sea basin, and it comes back to this wider look at a basin level. Cumulative impact assessments to fully understand the complete impacts of offshore wind farms. Seabirds and like many other species within the marine environment are incredibly mobile. The impacts of one wind farm, as an example, is not their only impact. They will be coming across multiple wind farms out at sea, and they travel huge distances in search of food across migration paths. So we need to consider that when we are doing our impact assessments. We need to consider the full picture beyond that individual project level. Things like innovative industry standards, how we can mitigate and prevent that harm, drive that innovation, need to be embedded in the process. We need the legislation to be able to support that and bring that into the forefront. And as we learn these things, as we innovate, as we develop new standards, as we build on our evidence base, we need robust adaptive management. We need to be able to develop this and learn and build as we go. I've put in here as well, ecological, meaningful, strategic compensation. We're looking at compensation here and how that can be applied on a strategic level. It cannot work on that project level, but it needs to benefit those species and habitats being impacted. It needs to be targeted. It needs to protect the site integrity, and therefore it needs to be ecologically coherent. So something as well along all of this, and then something which is particularly relevant here across the North Sea, and as we've mentioned already, is we need to be working strategically and cooperatively across borders. It makes it very difficult being in the UK to be able to do that, and we need to see ways of moving that forward. And conversations and webinars and forums like this are a fantastic opportunity to share lessons learned and develop our thinking here and create that work on the geographical skill that is needed for nature. A seabird doesn't know if it's in UK, Belgium, Dutch waters, and we need to be aware of that as we develop it. So then we also have the nature enhancement and restoration side of things. So you have this nature protection, that is your halting loss, and then we need to build back the curve and come back and building that resilience. So as we enhance and restore, it's building up. We have to be thinking about, in terms of seabirds and using them as an example here, they need 3 core things: safe places to breed, safe places to feed, and an abundance of food. Fairly simple to approach. It's not strictly solved by the offshore wind industry. So some of it can't be. We have statutory requirements, as we were talking about with good environmental status, to protect nature, and they must be upheld. So in the cases that it's not down to industry to directly be involved in the support and in the enhancement and restoration, we can see the facilitation through funding mechanisms, through much wider funding mechanisms that we're seeing through funding pots to help facilitate these things to take place. They're not necessarily tied down to a component such as compensation, as an example. So some measures for enhancement are required to build resilience in seabird populations in the face of mounting pressures of the marine environment. It is not to compensate for the additional pressure of offshore wind. Taking things like nature inclusive design in this process as well, it absolutely can benefit some species and habitats, and it is absolutely vital to be part of that process. So it should be encouraged within the life cycle of an offshore wind farm. However, it won't directly benefit nature that is displaced from a wind farm. So as we keep coming back to seabirds, incredibly mobile species, a nature positive approach must be delivered at that larger scale, as individual actions on that wind farm are unlikely to benefit such mobile species on that scale. Nonetheless, all areas of enhancement and restoration, whether it's as a direct or indirect result of industry action, they're going to require holistic marine spatial planning. We need to see better spatial planning across our seas, and this is something we can collaborate and strive for, and it needs that government leadership to enable that. So to summarize a lot of those points, this kind of visual here hopes to demonstrate what we mean by this full suite of measures. One option, nature inclusive design, strategic compensation, are not going to solve the issue alone. It requires a complete suite of measures. It's an entire toolbox of measures that we're using here. We need to work through together how individual components and measures can be additional to these statutory requirements to achieve good environmental status. And industry investment must come on top of redoubled government effort here. So this is how we can collaborate, if we can facilitate and provide help with each other. They need to be measurable, they need to be time bound, and they need to be working across multiple industries here as well. I'm conscious of time, so just as a brief example of how we can start to put the good in good environmental status and what we mean by some of these through some of these work examples. By 2050, we could be seeing different measures, such as for safe places to breed. We could be looking at strategic rollout of projects to eradicate invasive non-native species, such as rodents, from our most important seabird islands, cutting predation and increasing breeding success. So we could be seeing an industry supported strategic program. And again, strategic doesn't constitute into compensation, but governments have then facilitated that to happen on the nationwide scale that needs to happen. It's facilitating it on the scale that needs to occur for seabirds. Safe places to feed, we're looking at holistic marine spatial plans led by governments to better manage our marine space. And this will just provide that clarity for all marine users, dedicating areas of our seas for wildlife, for nature protection. And then also having things like a robust and effectively monitored bycatch mitigation program, providing that safety through vessels. And this can be, again, facilitated on the scale through government, through funding, through different components of industry and different areas like that. And thinking about abundance of food, we need to be looking at remote electronic monitoring of our vessels to understand with fishing activity. We could be closing our waters to certain fishing activities as well, and applying all of these in different measures. So it's a brief kind of whistle-stop tour of a very wide suite of measures that need to take place. It is complicated, it is a headache, it is trying to work it out. I think a lot of us today, when we've been talking about this, is trying to understand it more. And this is where we are all here working together. It's where we can collaborate. It's where we can define these measurable actions and build on that. And that's how we're going to achieve this truly transformative energy transition. We need to consider this hand in hand. It is a nature and climate emergency. And it's areas like this that we can see the benefit. It is happening on a massive scale, and that is to our benefit. The fact that we can see this across all of our seas is an opportunity here to reform how we do it, provide areas for seabirds, for nature, for wildlife, and develop that further. So thank you. I'll stop talking now and stop blabbering on about it, and I'll let Amy come in.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Unfortunately, Amy is not here, so we had a last-minute issue. She cannot join, so obviously, we won't have unfortunately the industry perspective. So we will open then the discussion now. If there is anyone from industry in the room, feel free to come in the discussion and to also give, even if it's less prepared, but like your perspective in the discussion. Otherwise, I open also now the room for questions. But thank you very much. It was a very good presentation, and I think it's really good to close our webinars with this, because it's really like linked to everything we discussed in the last 4 weeks. So yeah, if there is any question, that's the time. Any reflection, any comments? Yeah, I think we can have a longer discussion in place of a second presentation. And I see Niels. Hey.
Yeah, I'm always here. I'm lurking. I'm listening to what you guys say, and I am hearing a lot of words that I have heard before, just to start being provocative. Samuel, thanks for that, and I appreciate your positive thinking in nature positive ways. So I'm not going to be negative or anything like that, but I'll still want to know. Let's just stick with the MSP. You say MSP a lot, and you focus a lot on, using that tool as a way of, reaching many other tools. As we have seen, The MSP has been used a little bit like that, left-handed, kind of interesting. Some countries place a lot of emphasis to it. Some countries consider it being legally binding. Some others just think it's a very interesting exercise, but And above all, countries bordering other countries have a completely different view and sets of understanding of this MSP tool and MSP in general. So I'm just curious, of all the things you said, and even looking forward to the 2050 sort of time span or whatever, what is it that has to change now to make these things work better? Because the socioeconomic, oh my God, poor fisherman stuff is going to be there. And the, oh my God, what about all this stuff? It's much more worth in money terms than that, and blah, blah, blah. All these economic considerations, all these sort of slashing and slashing other priorities that just leaves MSP and some of these things in the nice to have corner. What has to change now for us to really make progress? Because we can't wait. We have to start something now to be able to, really get there. So just is it procedural? Is it legal? Is it science? Is it all of the above? Is it, basically just downplaying certain socioeconomic values to others? What is it that we need to produce? What is it that we need to start? That was a big one, but it is just, we have heard many of these acronyms, these terms of whatever, many years, many times, but we all know it hits brick walls basically over and over. And I have some explanations for the reason for it myself, but what do you think?
Yeah, it is a big one. It's a big question, and I'll give my view on it, and others please feel free to chip in and sort of continue the discussion. I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of all of the above. I think we need to see the legal, the scientific, the campaigning, the communications. I think it's a combination of everything. I mean, MSP won't work successfully for nature unless we have the evidence to back up the least sensitive areas as a start. But I think what we're looking for here is this kind of, I don't know how we do this, and I don't know what we need to see. And it's something that I keep coming back to and thinking in my own space, is that what do we need to do to provide that pressure? How can we collaborate? How can we produce something which shows a united voice here to say, whether you are developing a wind farm, whether you are fishing for food, whether you're trying to stop fishing for food, whether you are protecting this area for seabirds, we need that mapped out. We need that on our seas. And what is it? What can we produce here to kind of push for that? Is it a campaign? Is it kind of a joint statement that we can provide and actually drive to see that action? Because I think you're right. And I think we've been calling for it for decades on the scale that it needs to happen. We've been calling for it, in the UK as an example, the fact that it is so disjointed between all of our 4 devolved nations is difficult, because we have certain nations in certain places, and getting those all up to speed and aligning them is going to be much more beneficial. And it's something that we're working on here within our devolved nations, is building that up. I think we have an opportunity where we are developing at an early stage, taking the Celtic Sea as an example. Not yet construction happening there, but there is a lot on the way. There's a lot of floating offshore wind coming. So we are putting a lot of time and effort into that area of sea as a starting point to be like, look, we messed up in the southern North Sea. It's a very crowded space. There are a lot of impacts that happened there. Let's not repeat that process, and let's learn from that. In answer to what we do and how we do that, I don't know. I don't know what is the exact next step, but I think what is definitely apparent is we can't avoid problems because they are too complicated. We can't not bring fisheries into the conversation at the moment through fear of it getting too heated and too complicated, because at the end of the day, they're all using the same space. We need to be all talking in the same room. We need to be having these conversations across multiple industries. They can't be kept behind closed doors. We need to move away from this system of let's kind of protect each industry and protect each area. We are all using this sea space. It is all within our interest to protect it. So how we get to that stage, and that isn't a new opinion, and that is something that has been happening for decades and decades of of conversations from conservationists. So I think it feels like we're in a different space of we've never known this much about our marine environment than we have before. It doesn't mean the messaging changes, but it puts us in a good position to shift this. And hopefully, as we start to collaborate and as we continue these conversations and start to develop this, we can start to see changes happening. And I'm keen to hear if people have a great idea for shifting this. But we're getting there. We are making progress bit by bit, and hopefully we'll keep going bit by bit, and we'll get there.
Yeah, I can try to build a bit on this. I think, yeah, we are, it's a process definitely, and we are far from there. But I think the fact that now we are discussing also with industry and TSOs in this coalition is it needed also some years to also understand how we will work together, and that everything takes a lot of time, but that's a kind of part of the process. And indeed, maybe a gap is the discussion with other stakeholders, indeed, because that's something when we talk with industry and we try to challenge them on this perspective of finding solution outside of project and having more holistic approach of how do we improve the situation at regional level. They share this, but they also keep saying that, I mean, they are not responsible for this, and so why should they be paying for it, or why should they be, you know, like, so they agree to be part of a process, but they feel they shouldn't be the only one also. So I think it's about how, and I don't have an answer yet, but I think it's a process and we should all try to contribute to it. But it's about how we convince everyone to be on the same process with the same aim, and we start talking to each other. And that's, I think, as an NGO, as NGOs, that's something we really feel that is lacking, particular with, I mean, in terms of the way we can build be constructive with fishers, for example. It's something that we really, I think, will be a challenge for us in the next years. And I think we need to go there. And I think also in terms of to connect it to more general discussion we have as NGOs also, but not only in terms of the whole, I think it's linked to the whole governance of the EU, but not only, you know, like until now, everything was kind of addressed in silo with different policies and different bodies. And now it's a time, I feel, and my feeling is that everyone start to go there to realize that we need to break those silo and to connect everything and to have more cross-cutting and transversal discussion. But indeed, it will require time and maybe more engagement from our side, but not only. Definitely, other stakeholders are key.
But do you feel, sorry if I can just cut into both of you, because one thing is clear, I think. In many cases, NGOs is going to have to step back and say, okay, yeah, there's a negative impact, and we're going to live with that. We're not going to protest that. We're going to be okay with that. Or, because there's a lot of that too, that, you know, if someone takes a step in one direction, the other ones also need to take a step in the direction. And I feel quite a few times we're the ones that are adamant. We're the ones that are saying, no. So we're gonna sacrifice both some birds, bats, and fish. Okay, so how about that? That's it. Are we okay with that? I'm just throwing it out. I mean, it just feels sometimes that we fight hard to get a few small victories, and then we really don't want to give anything up, and that doesn't make us great in a discussion table sometimes. Okay, just a food for thought.
Yeah, I'm sure there is a part of trade-offs that will be necessary indeed, and that's something that is difficult to admit. I agree, but I wouldn't say that we are the ones saying no. At least in the way I see it, we are the one trying to engage to find solutions, while other stakeholders are more in the position of they don't want to leave anything and creating actually more this conflictual opposition. So I wouldn't say I see your point, and yeah, it's very difficult. It put us in a very difficult situation indeed. But I think that's something we should start to really think all together about what we need to preserve, and and what we need not only to protect in priority, but that's why this idea of enhancing and restoring nature alongside energy transition is actually the way forward. Samuel, I don't know if you wanted to add something. I've seen that you.
No, to be honest, you kind of summed that up there. I think, yeah, there are difficult decisions to be had and how we approach this. And this is why I think the concept of this strategic approach, more holistic, is needed so much, because we need to be thinking about this across an ecosystem and across a basin level, and how we ensure that in a case where particular colonies are heavily impacted, thinking of seabirds, are heavily impacted by development, by fishery, by whatever it may be, that there is resilience built across that ecosystem and across that basin level. And that is what is currently missing. And I think this is what we cannot give on. And this is, as Anouk was saying, this is where we must continue to develop that solutions focused and be like, okay, this is how we can develop it and build it from there. So it's a difficult topic. It's a difficult conversation.
Bob, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to add that the Blue Growth Strategy, so the EU Blue Growth Strategy and the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, both, so for those who don't know, but I guess there's a few of you, so we need 30% marine protected areas by 2030 and 10% strict protection, whereas the Blue Growth Strategy envisions multiple hundreds of gigawatts of offshore renewables in the North Sea. Both lay claim to large parts of the North Sea or other marine areas. So these are very important drivers for marine spatial planning. And they need to be enforced in the next few years. So there's a lot of pressure right now to actually do the work for marine spatial planning and to study how, for example, offshore wind farms could be considered other effective conservation measures depending on the target species, or the target natural values. And then in response to Niels, it is very expensive not to respect nature. Industry is suffering, or suffering is the wrong word. Industry is hampered if you do not take into account nature beforehand, because then they end up in legal conflict, which lasts for years and which will impact their bottom line. So I would say it is in their advantage to proactively identify which areas are suitable for development and under which conditions development can move forward. So they are not always working against conservation in this way.
Thank you. And that's why like tools that we try to develop to help the planning is like at a more regional level. It's really key. Niels, I see that you wanted to react.
Yeah, I just wanted to. You said something that I just had to react to regarding OECMs. So as you know, an OECM is a measure in place that something is done in an area that creates a positive side effect or multiple positive biodiversity effect, meaning that any kind of considerations to any kind of offshore windmill or parks or whatever is 20 years away or something before they can be considered an OECM, at least definitely to our understanding and our thinking of the matter. So in a way, OECM linking to windmills is sort of a non-issue for quite some time, and even then we are highly questioning large infrastructure project as part of as a solution or a consideration of the OECMs. As you know, they are counting against that 30% target, and also those MPAs that we have in those 30% are also now being targeted with windmills. So it's actually the same areas they're fighting for in a way, as you just said. The MSP, the conflict, there are problems. But OECM issue is a separate one, which I feel is important that we should have a common understanding on, which I don't think we have. But the fact that you mentioned it just triggered my intervention. Thanks.
Glad I could provoke you.
Is there any question or comments or reaction to Tim, please?
Yes, Samuel, thanks for your presentation. I like the report very much. It's indeed a very nice close-off, I think, of the session. Very nice you lighted out bird flu as a major concern of this moment, which is really changing things. And I already saw plannings for ecological research on the ecological effects of wind farms that did not take into account at all the impacts of bird flu on populations, which completely changes some of the calculations. So very nice you mentioned it. My question is on the mitigation hierarchy. You mentioned that we really should follow those steps of prevent and then mitigate and then compensate. I think, well, let me be a little bit provocative. Could the report lead to the effect that wind farm operators think, okay, compensation, there's a lots of compensation in this report. Let's skip the mitigation part. I think I see this happening. That's why I'm asking. I see this happening. They like to standardize the wind turbines and then say, okay, maybe they are not perfect for birds, but it's so much cheaper. So let's invest in compensation. What would be your reply to this?
Yeah, we see that as well. We see it with a lot of cases coming forward. Is that compensation? There is a lot of investment going into it. I mean, here in the UK, we have entire collaborative coalitions being put forward to work out compensation. It very much became a talking point, and we've been investing a lot of time and effort into it. And it was something that, you know, I was on a personal level conscious of, is that, yes, you know, compensation, whether it's project level or strategic level, it's still compensation. It still should be part of that mitigation hierarchy. The response to that is this kind of approach of, we should be doing things in the face of these mounting pressures. It is not to compensate for offshore wind. Offshore wind is not, you know, the only pressure out there. There are mounting pressures. There are statutory requirements that must be upheld to combat a lot of this. Compensation seems to be the easy answer, but at the end of the day, it's your, if it can be successful, it's your kind of your cherry on top. It's your, okay, you've avoided, you've mitigated, you can't do that, let's compensate for that damage. It's not going to fix seabirds in their declines. There is a reason why it is the residual impacts. It's what can't be fixed later on. So it's a tricky one, because there are a lot of cases where measures being put forward that necessarily aren't considered to be ecologically meaningful, that won't have that impact. And I think the tricky part, Tim, is how, and this is building on Neil's point of how we shift from an NGO to be like, okay, how do we see that not working? How do we see that working? Are we willing to accept some damage? Are we not? And how we balance that, I think, is really tricky. And I think with compensation, it becomes even more difficult. But it also varies depending on that, on the country itself. We're here in the UK, it's a legal requirement in England, becoming so more in Scotland, but it's not currently legally required in Wales and Northern Ireland. And so we're driving hard on that mitigation hierarchy, on that, okay, it's not your answer, let's build through that process. So I appreciate that wasn't like a very simple answer of what I would say to that, but it's that process of making sure that it is very much withheld in its place. It's very much within that tool of measures that need to be implemented on a wider scale.
Thank you, Samuel. Is there any Other points, question, remarks? Yeah, Tim.
Yes, maybe to add on top of my previous question, I think we still should make sure we keep on asking attention for mitigation measures that can be taken at wind turbines. It's all very expensive, like the curtailment measure that's now being developed in the Netherlands and implemented. But there I see it's still in its early stages. It's based on modeling that can still be improved a lot. So it's all extremely expensive. And I would have no problems with the industry making some calculations of how expensive it is in terms of money, which they will do anyway, but also in terms of CO2 footprint. If you stop turbines, this is very costly also in that respect. So you need to be transparent about the costs, and then we will get to the questions: what are the benefits for birds? And then it's difficult to count actual numbers of birds that you saved. So it will lead to that. So yeah, that's maybe the point I would like to make, that we need to make sure that we keep on investing in that. And it is definitely also in your report, but we need to make sure that also this not so easy way, that there's a lot of attention to that. It's the expensive way, but there's still a lot to be gained also with innovation. I mean, there's still a lot to be learned also about how effective these measures can be.
Yeah, just to continue that, Tim, it's absolutely, they do very much hold a very significant place in this process. And at the end of the day, if you're building a giant metal fan in the sea, there will be direct impact from that place. So anything that we can be investing and innovating and developing to mitigate that is absolutely vital to do so. And it's just making sure that each area is, I think that's going to be the tricky part here, is that each area needs its entire attention, if that makes sense. Each area needs everyone's full attention to give it as much capacity as we can. And that's, I think, where we're struggling particularly, is that how do we do all of this at the same time? But somehow we have to, and yeah, the mitigation and the nature inclusive design is such a huge component of that needs to always be considered. So absolutely right.
Any last question or comment before we wrap up? Niels?
Yes, thanks. It's been an interesting series of talks, and you know, in the process also we've had in the Baltic, we've concluded our own sort of guidelines on, you know, what is useful or not useful when considering placement of these windmills. The one thing that we always stumble on or come into as a difficult unknown is, of course, the massive cumulative or agglomerative or whatever, you know, situation we will have. We are currently in a situation where there might be mitigation that works. There might be mitigation / compensation, both sort of in situ, but potentially elsewhere, that can be beneficial for populations. But there will be a point where it's just, no, but just wait, hold on. You know, we can't have one more, because it's just, you know, it's just not going to work. There's just not going to be untouched space or you know, stretches of space for birds or fish or whatever to migrate. So this is a scary one that I don't know in what way we've covered fully here or you know, discussed in general. I mean, North Sea is obviously a battle zone in a sense when it comes to all the member states or the countries that want to place stuff there. The Baltic is the same. Baltic is a shallow little lake, basically, that is very interesting because it is shallow, so you can place stuff everywhere. But this cumulative thing, and thinking again back to you, Samuel, the MSP and all these things, there has to be someone at some point that just says, oh, wait, hold on, no, it doesn't matter how great it is, we cannot put one more in here. How has anyone done this math? Has anyone figured these figures, looked at, you know, the actual space, the actual amount of materials, things we're going to put out there, and what it may actually mean, you know, if all these plans are realized, because I haven't seen anything like that. All these things that come out of member states are insane. I mean, oh yeah, we're going to build maybe 8,000 new ones. Oh, you too? Oh, we're doing the same. You know, it's just incredible numbers. So this overarching MSP, if you like, or just capacity ceiling studies or whatever, where are those? Because at some point, my point is, at some point, all of the things we've basically discussed on, you know, positive, doing better, checking this, mitigating that, will be void, because it's just not there. So has anyone looked at that? Has anyone taken these serious, you know, big figures and put them together and like, this is not going to work? Or is that just anyway so far away in the future that doesn't really matter? Or what are we thinking?
Samuel, do you want to take the floor? I can try to start answering this.
Yeah,
I mean,
I didn't know. I didn't know who was going to jump in. I know Tim's popped his hand up as well, but I don't think it's too far away that we don't need to worry about it. I think it's kind of, I remember having a conversation last year with a developer who we were trying to get hold of data in the UK of how much was in the pipeline, and we had an idea of what we thought it was, and the developer said a figure that was about 3 times what we thought it was, and we started to track down more data and dig deeper, and kind of now suddenly we're available on the maps that are being put out of how much offshore wind, particularly in the UK but across the EU, is being developed. And it is scary. It's scary when you look at that. It's scary when you think about that. We have the development zone, so there is we're not entirely sure where exactly the wind farm is going to be at this point in time, but it gives us an idea. And we haven't, I mean, as the RSPB, we haven't got a specific project to be looking at that exactly, but it's something that I think we are starting to develop as we look at these various maps, and maybe we should, maybe that is something that we can be investing in and looking into. I know there's the sensitivity mapping that the BirdLife guys are looking at as well, and different areas, and yeah, I think I do agree. I do see it as an incredibly valuable tool that I think we need to be looking at, that also I think governments should be wanting to look at, and they should be doing, and it's how we can facilitate that and not have to do, it sounds bad, but not have to do their job for them, and kind of facilitate that and support that and make sure that we can all do this. Anouk or Tim, I didn't know if you wanted to fill in.
Yes, thank you. No, exactly, that's what I wanted to say. And also, so that no one has the tools to do this alone. That's exactly the point, you know, like we can all contribute to this, but we will need also the wind industry to contribute to help us understanding what it means, you know what I mean? So like, because we don't have all the information that are and also because some will take time to understand the impact. So that's why we come from a place where we say that it's not possible to happen without the reduction of other pressures. So that's, even if nature positive approach, it sounds like it's all positive and all good. No, it's about saying that we have an issue of carrying capacity. The seas are already in a very bad state, and if we want this transition to happen at this scale, we will need to find solutions, and very quickly. And it's a mix of solutions. There is not one solution. It's not only about mitigation. It's not only about nature inclusive design. It's not only about planning. It's not only about reducing other activities. It's a mix of everything. And for this, we need all the stakeholders to be working together, because only for understanding the situation, we need information from everyone, and we need everyone to work together. I think the project that was presented before by Bob on the monitoring, I think it's a good example of how people can work together from all the different kind of stakeholder in a region, and we should really be promoting this. And that's what we try to do, and that's what we always, like at BirdLife, we try to use the tools we have and to push for projects at a bigger scale with other stakeholders, and to contribute to this, because we can't alone have this not only analysis but also solutions. I mean, it's really clearly where we are. So yeah, I don't know if it answers the question more or less.
No, you said two concrete things there, at least. I mean, this overarching analysis of carrying capacity, basically. Someone has to do it, or someone should initiate that. I guess that is something we should do. And if we're not doing it, we should push the Commission to be doing it in sea basin level or sub sea basin levels, etc., where one pressure has to go in front of the other, or etc. You know, these types of overarching things I haven't seen. And like I said, the 15,000 plus windmills they're thinking of in parts of the Baltic. I mean, that's alone is just from just a sensible kind of wait a minute. That's just not. That's not even plausible. But oh, it is. Repower, go, yes, more money. You know, so it's going to be a race. We've seen similar things up here in the north before, where we in a fairly short time built some, I don't know, 3,000-4,000 hydropower stations in Finland, Sweden together. That turned out to be a mess, and most of them are dysfunctional, not even working, but they're still standing there. So yeah, but Tim wanted to tell me off, probably have a solution to all this.
So the solution is unfortunately not, but especially not on knowing all the cumulative impacts and pressure factors, etc. But I think something that is at least a little bit hopeful is the way now the Dutch government approached the expansion of offshore wind and calculating the impact on birds, where they did also include in their calculations the wind farms that were planned in Germany, in Great Britain. So they included all nearby wind farms in their calculations of the estimated impact on birds that were migrating or the birds that are using the area. And I think that's a hopeful approach, and probably more realistic to do at least those things and make sure that you make some progress there to have this full basin calculations, even though they're still limited and they're only looking at this specific direct impact. But I think that's a promising approach, and there might be, if we know more about effects underwater, we can start to include more effects and try and do the same thing. And I think that's interesting. And then I suggest next to that you could do better mapping of all the pressure factors, and then probably it will be, for a long time, will be up to expert judgment to try and do what's best. But we all want a good cumulative impact assessment, and we need to keep on trying to get closer to that. But it will be very difficult, and the error bars will be huge, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Tim. Pierre-Yves, if you want to come in.
Hello, everyone. Just to react on Tim and Neil's reaction, especially on Neil's statement on this risk that we face, because we're looking at this number of turbines at sea with an exponential. I think it's a math formula. Can't remember it. It's not logarithm. It's not linear. It's exponential. Sorry, exponential. We have in France. I can remember one of the presentation, the first webinar. Anouk, it was from Wind Europe, I think. They said in France it's really interesting because they can anticipate, because there is the pluriannual planification of energy, which means that for the 10 or 15 next years we have the capacity so that the sector can anticipate and get prepared. So we should know how much of those turbines we will see at sea for the next years. So Niels, in France, we have this policy, which means that we know exactly what's going to happen. But for the next run, it's going to happen this year. And we are getting a bit afraid of the number that are starting to be leaked, I would say. And it seems that you have two approaches. You have the white page approach, depending on the carrier capacity. So you're doing the marine spatial planning and you look at the sensitive areas, and you look at where there is still places to build offshore wind farms, and then you translate this as the number of turbines, and you translate that in the number of megawatt. Then you know how much you can produce at sea. But there's the other approach, which is the need in terms of megawatt production that comes from the demand. And then you just took how much you have in terms of scenarios. You take the scenarios of production and needs for production, and then you translate it into number of turbines at sea. And then you look at, this is how much kilometer square I need at sea, and this is where we have to find areas, which is another approach. We fear that is going to be the second approach for the MSP, which is going to be very complicated because it's like an impossible puzzle to try to put all those pieces together. And we will lack information, environmental information, to do such a work. And even though, Anouk, you're talking about carrying capacity, we don't know those carrying capacity. We have no idea of this carrying capacity. So we try to get prepared, Niels, here in the Med, because it's going fast in the Mediterranean Sea. It's floating, but it's still going very fast. And a lot in Spain, in Italy, now in Greece. There's a lot of wind also in Greece and Turkey. So, and we know you face this in the Northern Sea, Baltic, and it's going to be very complicated in the Med. And this is very also impacted sea. We have a presentation also in one of the session from North Sea Foundation saying that Mediterranean Sea was different from North Sea because it was more pristine environment, but I wouldn't say so. It's really impacted sea in different ways. You have less all those fishery that have impacted the seafloor, but you have more of the activities. You have it's the first sea at the international level for cruise ships, for maritime transport and densities, for any other things. And you also have oil and gas still happening in Med. So there's an issue, of course, and we have no queue because we have no really impact measure that have been tested. We don't know if the rate reduction and the avoidance measure will be useful here in the Med, because there is no RETEX, there is no offshore wind farm at sea, so we don't know what's going to happen, especially on this new technology floating, and it's very hardly to be known. So we have done a lot of things to get knowledge, to talk with industry. We have tried to talk with them, and still trying to talk with them, trying to find the best way. And we are really putting a lot of energy as NGOs. It takes a lot of time. It's really time consuming in discussion, and so we'll try to work on the intelligence and collective intelligence for now, and try to ask the true questions, the real questions. And for the team question about the setting, it's a very complicated one. Should we insist to ask for offsetting, or should we just insist to have only mitigation and avoidance, saying no offsetting because the first one has to be prioritized, even the only one? And it's really complicated now because you have impact under the sea. You have pelagic and benthic habitats also, not only birds, and there is no mitigation that will operate for some components in the ecosystem, especially the marine ecosystem. So we will, I don't know, we're still looking for the real impactful offsetting. I would say that offsetting should be very expensive. I should say that offsetting should be very expensive, not small offsetting. And every measures that we should probably defend or be in favor with should be very expensive. One, meaning nature is expensive because it takes a lot of money to monitor, to follow, to control, to survey, to be to take everyone into one boat to be sure that in some places the ocean is be protected and restored. Thank you very much for all your comments.
Thank you. I don't know if someone wants to react quickly. We are a bit beyond time, so I mean, it was very interesting, and there is certainly more to discuss. But
yeah, we will continue for years, so don't worry.
Niels, you want to say?
No, I want to say thank you for arranging all this, and very well done. And you know, it like I said, it gives us all, you know, things to think about and move forward with, and exactly reflections that just now Pierre came with here is true. These are very complex and strange happenings, and we see all kinds of weird ways of how a push or demand and push is being used. And I guess my comment to you, Pierre, is more or less, the problem is, or if one country has a good idea, what are the adjacent countries doing? If they're doing exactly the same, then it's like, wait a minute, so you're doing that also? But then, okay, then the whole thing changes. And, you know, so all these things on a collaborative level, I see, you know, we're going to be seeing basically energy fights in the future, where people are going to say, oh, you just took up all the space. We also need energy, like from a nationalistic point of view, when energy doesn't see, in a way, borders today. It's shipped in cables everywhere. So there's a lot of things on a nation EU level scale to reconsider when it comes to energy production, which I feel we haven't touched upon, but that's a completely different topic.
Yeah.
And a different area. But thank you so much, and let's reconvene.
Yeah, exactly. So just very short wrap up to say thank you all very much. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and as Niels just said, it was a kind of starting a process, because it was more to give also to all NGOs information and the state of play of what we are discussing in this Ocean Coalition, what we are doing as organization. Definitely, we all see that we need to keep talking to each other. Because, as you say, energy, but also ecology is a question of, there is no borders to it, and we need to be able to discuss with other stakeholders, but also together as civil society organization, as scientific organization, because we need to find solutions that are also relevant and used somewhere else. So just to say a big thing, we will follow up with the recording of the seminars, with all the presentation, and please reach out to us if you want to keep the conversation going, if you want to that we organize different forum for discussion, or include you inform you about our work. So reach out to us, don't hesitate, we are here. We are really happy to see so many different organizations today. Yeah, and let's keep the conversation continue, and thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.